Thank you for offering me speaking a bit earlier, which is easier for me because it's 9:30 p.m. at my place, quite late. I never spoke in a conference this late. I'm going to outline what I'm going to write in my chapter, which was planned to reflect the phenomenon of theosis, of deification in the church. Well, I still want to place this phenomenon in the ecclesiology as a part of ecclesiology. However, at the same time, I'd like also to place the phenomenon of deification to another framework, the dialectical framework, the framework of the early Christian logics, categories to be more precise, if I may. And I'll explain why and how these two frameworks, the church and this dialectical framework, are connected. So essentially, I'm not going to exhaust all the categories of the early Christian logics, dialectics, but I'm going to use some of the categories, the most important ones, like, for instance, the category of common and particular, commonality and particularity, tokinon and toidion. We know that this categorical pair applies mostly to the ontological things and beings, including God, three hypostases and one common nature, Christ, human beings, and so forth. But I'm going to place the phenomenon of deification within this framework of the commonality and particularity. Another logical pair that I'd like to explore is the difference between potentiality and actuality, what Aristotle named τη δύναμη and τη ενεργία. Also, this categorical pair applies mostly to the ontological things and phenomena. I'm going to apply it to theosis, to deification. I'm going to argue that even soteriology, the phenomenon of salvation, if I may call it this way, can be placed or can be kind of differentiated between the common salvation and particular salvation. And salvation, as it was mentioned in the introductory session today, salvation is it's an arc which is within a larger arc of deification. So deification can be also differentiated as the common deification and particular deification. What I mean is, when we are talking about the common salvation and common deification, we are talking about the entire human nature, the entire humankind, which has been saved through the incarnation of Christ. It is a result, the common deification and common salvation are the result of anakephaleusis, recapitulatio, the embracing, the assumption of the human nature and essentially, effectively, of the entire creation by through the incarnation of God in the person of Jesus Christ. So this is the common salvation of the entire human nature, and this is also, it also implies the common deification of the entire human nature, which God united with divinity through Jesus Christ. This common salvation and common deification becomes appropriated by individuals, by individual members of the church. And that's how the common salvation and common deification become particular salvation and particular deification. Particular deification happens as a result, the common deification is a result of anakephaleusis, of recapitulatio. particular deification happens as a result of asceticism, ascetical practices, when a person within the church appropriates the possibility, the potentiality of deification in his or her own life. I should mention in this regard that the categories of potentiality and actuality, the dynami and the energia, this is a kind of universal framework, which is applicable even to things like, for instance, like the human being created in the image and likeness of God. We could say that imago Dei, the image of God, icon to Theou, is a potentiality, is something which can be called the dynami, which becomes the likeness, which is the actuality, which can be called the energia, what exists, the energia. This is of course in case if we differentiate between the image and likeness of God, imago Dei and likeness of God. Not every early theologian, not every father of the church made this differentiation, but certainly some of them did, and we can render the differentiation between the image of God and likeness of God as potentiality and actuality. This binary of potentiality and actuality also explains the phenomenon of freedom. And in the patristic texts, not all of them, but some of them certainly, we find a differentiation between two synonymous terms which explain freedom. One term is avtexousion, to avtexousion, which applies to the potentiality of freedom, something which is innate in the human nature, in the common human nature, and eleftheria as something which is achieved, as something which has been assigned to every human being, individual human being. This is a kind of actuality, the actuality of freedom. The same binary of potentiality and actuality also applies to deification. That's kind of the core of the discussion, the point I want to arrive at. And in the patristic texts, not all of them, but some of them certainly, there is a differentiation between isotheon, that I mentioned earlier in the discussion, and theosis. Isotheon is regarded by some fathers of the church as the potentiality, as something which belongs to the common nature, something innate in the humanity, which everyone has as a potentiality of becoming godlike, of becoming someone to reach a point which is a result of theosis as a process of transferring or transmitting this potentiality of isotheon to the actuality of theosis, of a person being actually divinized. Isotheon, which can be translated as equal to gods, was quite a popular term in the Greek mythology, and there is a huge corpus of hermeneutics on Homerus, on like in the Greek drama, theater, on Aristophanes, on Euripides, and so forth, that use the word isotheon in the sense that explains the status, ontological status of demigods. Those are kind of the creatures which came out as kind of marriage or relationship between gods and human beings, heroes and demigods. In the ancient lexica, this word isotheon is usually translated as angitheos, kind of demigod, or evdaimon, the happy ones, the term which is kind of explains this middle status between the divine status and the human status. In the Neoplatonic tradition, this word has been appropriated as well. We can find in Jamblichus, for instance, a phrase when he speaks about God equal deeds, isothea erga, when someone, a philosopher who has reached, the status of illumination, can act in the divine way. And Jamblichus argues that this is impossible without the assistance of gods. So he says that isothea erga can be done only with the assistance of gods. This term, isotheon, I found only one instance of this term in the Bible, which is, and again it is in the non-canonical, so-called non-canonical book, the second book of Maccabees, which speaks about an arrogant person. I quote Maccabees' second book. "And when he himself could not stand his own smell, he said these words, 'It is right to be subject to God, and that one who is mortal should not be minded arrogantly.'" Which translates "Mith niton on isothea phronin." So Maccabees essentially uses the word in a pejorative sense. The same negative context has influenced the Christian usage of the word isotheon. Several ancient authors used it its derivative form isotheia, in a very particular sense. Isotheia as a reference to the temptation of Adam and Eve in the paradise, when the snake promised them to have knowledge of the divine things. So this word isotheia was applied exactly to this arrogance of Adam and Eve. Particularly John Chrysostom uses the word isotheia in this sense. So Chrysostom was quite skeptical about isotheia. At the same time, he uses the word isotheon in a more positive sense, and he in particular says that let me quote, that all human beings are equal to the God. They are isothei, which is a very interesting reference. That means exactly that all human beings, meaning the entire nature, the common nature of the humankind, is isotheos. It's equal to God. That is a reference to this common aspect of the human being, which is described in application to deification by the word isotheon. Quite a few fathers, I should say. I should say that in general, I found approximately, a couple of hundreds references to this word in the patristic literature, and quite a few fathers used the word isotheon in the same sense of something positive, referring to the to the similarity of the human nature, of the entire human nature, to the divine being. Hesychius, in his lexicon, summarized this long line of references in his lexema, when he defines isotheia or isothei as something referring to the immortal soul. The term isotheon and its derivatives became particularly popular in the late Byzantine period, when exactly the discussions about theosis became kind of in the focus of the theological discourses. And such authors as Nikitas Choniatis, Ioannis Apokavkos, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Philotheos Kokinos, Dimitrios Kidonis, they use the word isotheon quite heavily. Gregory of Nyssa was very particular in equating or in bringing together the word isotheon together with the word aftexousion. Remember, I mentioned in the beginning that aftexousion in the early in this period of time was used exactly to signify the a kind of freedom which is innate in the human nature, which cannot be taken from the human nature, which is a constant, which is a potentiality of freedom in the human nature. And for Gregory, and he literally says that isotheon, avtexousion is equal to the God. It means that someone who has avtexousion is equal to the God. So he makes it very clear. I quote him, isotheon gar estinto avtexousion. So that's kind of a very clear reference that isotheon is a reference to the potentiality which is innate to the human nature. In this capacity, it applies to avtexousion. And I found also an interesting quote from Cyril of Alexandria, who connects isotheon with imago Dei. He does not speak it. He does not say it explicitly, but he uses these two words together, two phrases together. So this is a kind of a line of usage of the word isotheon, which applies to the entire human nature, which is exactly the commonality of deification, the deification as a result of the incarnation, which becomes as a possibility applicable to everyone. But every person is supposed to appropriate through his or her personal effort this deification and to become godlike, to reach this deification. And from this perspective, a particular sense makes the phrase of Pseudo Dionysius, who says, literally, theosis is assimilation of homeosis and unity with God as the accessible one. So Dionysius, continuing this line of thought, train of thought, essentially states that, implies that, he doesn't say it, but he may imply it, that yes, something like isotheon applies to the entire human nature, but theosis is the assimilation of homeosis of this potentiality by every given human individual. Now, in the end, I should bring the church here. So the church, in my kind of view, is the place where the common salvation translates into particular salvation of every given individual being, where imago Dei grows to the likeness of God, where avtexousion becomes eleftheria, and finally, where the potentiality of isotheon turns to the actuality of theosis.